awarded a D.Phil. His thesis was published as Measuring the Mind. He's worked for The Economist magazine since 1988, including as West Coast bureau chief, Washington bureau chief, and author of the Lexington column, management editor, and author of the Schumpeter column, and political editor, and author of the Beige Hawk column. He's the author or co-author of 10 books, including The Right Nation, Conservative Power in America with John Micklethwaite, Capitalism in America with Ellen Greenspan. His most recent book, which I recently read, is The Aristocracy of Talent, How Meritocracy Made the Modern World. I've rarely researched or been able to talk with someone who has so many interests that dovetail with mine, and very much looking forward to this conversation. So you published this Aristocracy of Talent, and it's the continuance of an interest that you've held for a long time. How is the book being received?
Well, I'm glad to say that the book has been extremely well received in Britain. It's been reviewed by all the leading periodicals on both the left and the right, and has been widely discussed on the radio and in various media outlets. In the United States, the reception has been much more muted, I would say. It hasn't been discussed anywhere near as widely, although there is discussion going on, and it's beginning to mount a bit. But what most irks me is it hasn't been reviewed by the New York Times. All the major publications in this country, by this country I mean Britain, where I'm sitting now, reviewed it. The New York Times hasn't reviewed it. The New York Review of Books hasn't reviewed it. A lot of the sort of mainstream, particularly liberal publications, reviewed it. Here in Britain, all the liberal publications reviewed it, and I thought, I expected to be more criticised than I was by the liberal publications. There was a sense in many liberal publications that this is an idea that we should grapple with and we shouldn't dismiss out of hand. I was very pleased by the reception both on the left and the right. For example, the New Statesman wrote a long and positive review of it. So for the New York Times not to have mentioned it at all, well, we all want to be reviewed by the New York Times because it's a big and important newspaper, but for them not to mention it at all, the New York Review of Books not to mention it at all, the New Yorker, all of these outlets, I was disappointed by that, just as I was extremely encouraged and pleased by the breadth of the reception in the United Kingdom.
Well, it seems to me to be a reflection of exactly what you're writing about in the book itself. I mean, you traverse the history of the idea of meritocracy and the practice of meritocracy, also contrasting it with forms of social organization that weren't meritocratic, either implicitly or explicitly. And you talk about the revolt against the idea of meritocracy, especially on the left, and the increasing potency, let's say, politically and psychologically, of that rebellion. Interestingly enough, also pointing out that at least at certain times in the 20th century, the meritocratic idea was fundamentally progressive and maybe was in its essence. So maybe I'd like to know from you. You did your thesis, your doctoral thesis, on measuring the mind, the history of that, and this has been a concern of yours for an extraordinarily long time. And I'd like to know what's at the bottom of that.
Sure. I wrote, I did a D.Phil in history at Oxford University, and my D.Phil was on the history of IQ testing, and particularly the history of IQ testing, the way that IQ testing shaped educational policy, because we had something called the 11 plus examination in Britain, which all people in the state sector had to sit, and which determined whether they went to grammar schools or secondary modern schools, i.e. elite academic schools or non-elite schools, and which was essentially an IQ test or a set of IQ tests. It's an extraordinary example of the massive public impact of a set of ideas about what constitutes mental ability and how you test that mental ability. So I was interested in that partly because I was myself a product of a grammar school, and I went to Oxford having been to a grammar school, and my entire educational career was determined by sitting this examination at the age of 11 and passing this examination and passing subsequent examinations. So it was a sort of a personal thing to me, but it also struck me as a very just thing that somebody from my background, which was a very ordinary background, could go to a really first-rate academic school and get an education that was comparable to people like Boris Johnson, people who went to Eton or Winchester. And so it always struck me that this examination, this way of organising educational opportunity, was a very intriguing thing. It was something that was subversive of the status quo, which was embodied in my mind by the private schools, the independent schools. And then the Labour government, which I naturally sort of gravitated towards and supported, came along and destroyed the grammar schools, abolished them in the name of comprehensive schools and in the name of getting rid of testing and selection and streaming and things like that. And it struck me, as a young person, this was an extraordinary thing for a supposedly progressive party to be doing, and it disillusioned me with it's the first thing. Many other things did subsequently, but it's the first thing that really disillusioned me with the socialist or the Labour project. So I got interested in the history of how this came to be, how the 11 plus came to reshape education in Britain, and how these ideas were first accepted and then rejected. And I discovered, I think, that most people in the history faculty at Oxford, which was a fairly conventional, conservative faculty, thought I was completely mad to be looking at this subject. And I found myself in the strange position of being somebody who was, looking at an unconventional subject, not political history or constitutional history, which was an unconventional subject, which would have put me in the camp of some, sort of deranged lefty, but actually from quite a conservative direction, because I thought that dismantling the 11 plus and dismantling the grammar schools was a terrible thing. So I would say I was intellectually quite homeless, but actually being intellectually homeless, I think, is quite appropriate to somebody who's interested in meritocracy, which ultimately I think is an idea which in political terms tends to be intellectually homeless.
So you do point out in the book, there's a phrase in your book, you say cruelty meritocracy, I believe, and you are referring there, despite the fact that you were a beneficiary of the 11 plus system, that the test, like it's a really sharp fork in the road, and perhaps it's too sharp a fork in the road in some sense to be palatable, and then I suppose the people who have dismantled those systems would object to your support for that system by saying, well, it allowed you through, and that was good for you, but there was all those other people who were arbitrarily denied the possibility of advancement. And I think the weak part of that argument is the idea that it's arbitrary, right? That's the crux of the matter.
Yeah.
What exactly does arbitrary mean? And you might also say that cruel as these examinations were, they were perhaps less cruel than what they prevented.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely. I wouldn't advocate for a return to the 11 plus. I think it was a system which was too much a matter of dividing people into sheep and goats. It was too once and for all. I think you have to have some sort of recourse to what happens if people have a bad day. And I would want a system in which you have a variegated set of selective schools, lots of second chances, lots of different types of schools. But I think there's a distinction between sort of a system which is short, sharp, and therefore obviously cruel, and a system which is very prolonged, seems to be very kind, and actually ends up being quite cruel. And I would say that what we've done is replace a system whereby you have, a one-off test which can benefit a large number of poorer people, with a system of very prolonged educational selection, which over a long period of time tends to be very biased towards people who have the resources to keep going through the system. So under the 11 plus, you have a number of people who would be selected at 11, would get a very good academic education, would get free educations at Oxford, Cambridge, or whatever university they went to, and then would go on to the fast stream of the civil service. Now, where you have a much more prolonged system, it's easier for people who don't have a lot of resources to be weeded out or to drop out. And so, it costs a lot of money to go to university, it costs a lot of money to go to graduate school. By prolonging the process of selection, it looks kinder on the surface, but deep down it can be a system which is much more socially biased towards richer people rather than people who might be deserving on the basis of their
You
innate
see the
abilities.
same conundrum. You see the same conundrum emerging to some degree with the use of statistically valid and reliable tests to do selection in the workplace.
Yes.
I mean, they have an error, so some people are going to be forbidden advancement as a consequence of that test because of error. But, and that's obviously unfortunate, it's particularly unfortunate for them. But placing someone in a position where the probability that they'll succeed over time is extremely low, and then tormenting them to death over a 1 year period while they fail dreadfully, and also burdening the company, let's say, with the fact of dealing with someone in a management position, for the sake of argument, who actually isn't competent to do that, doesn't strike me as a particularly just or empathic solution. And you know, part of the problem here is that, and this is, I think, part of the problem that we're facing as a society in general with the use of, let's say, intelligence tests, is they are the most powerful technology that research psychologists have ever invented by a large margin. And so if we equated them in some metaphoric sense to surgery, we might say, well, you don't want, surgery might be necessary, but you don't want to do it without an anesthetic. And you also want to be aware that the scalpel can kill. And so I think partly what we're wrestling with is, among many other things, is the fact that these tests are of incredible power in terms of their predictive ability, and we're not exactly sure what to do with that. I mean, when I started familiarizing myself with the IQ literature, it was actually quite disheartening in some sense, because I started to understand just how broad the ability range among human beings is, and how intractable that is in some measures in the lower, let's say, 10th. So one stat I came across at one point, and you detailed the use of IQ tests by the American military. They were picked up very rapidly by the military, and very successfully, and with many positive social consequences. But you know, the American military decided, I believe all three branches, and I believe this was in the 1980s, that it was illegal, it's now illegal in the US to induct someone into the armed forces if they have an IQ of less than 82. And that's 10%, approximately 10% of the population. And that is a dismal statistic, because the military is chronically hungry for people. And if their conclusion after close to 100 years of IQ testing was that 10% of the population can't be trained to do anything of any utility in the military, that has, well, that speaks for itself if you think it through. And so it's no wonder people are leery of these tests, and they're leery of what they reveal. And the easy thing to say is, well, what they reveal isn't true. You know, it's the tests themselves. But I'm afraid I couldn't swallow that. I spent 10 years looking at the IQ literature. And
well, I mean, when you talk about the military, there are two big questions here. One is the First World War, when a lot of the IQ testing was fairly crude, and when they had this, they tended, and a lot of literature which came out of the First World War was quite racist. And I think Bingham, for one, recanted on what he'd said in 1930. He said, no, we were wrong. It was a premature application of our methods. We should have been more sensitive about cultural differences and linguistic abilities, because you have a huge population of new immigrants. After the Second World War, I think it was a much more developed science, and the most important thing it revealed in both Britain, but most specifically in America, was the huge amount of talent there was in the population that was being underutilized.
Right.
And so out of that comes the GI Bill, because people are saying, gosh, there are all these clever people, we're a technical scientific civilization, we must use them, we must promote them. So I think there's a big difference on the impact of the two things. But these two questions that you raise, one is the accuracy of the tests, but the other is that, whether they're accurate or not, but the other is, if they are accurate, what they reveal about the human population, and particularly the sheer range of abilities within the human population, and so which is very wide. And so the person who invented the term meritocracy was Michael Young, who wrote this wonderful, magnificent, sort of really clever book in 1958 called The Rise of the Meritocracy. And what he was saying in that book was that the problem with meritocracy, the problem with IQ tests, is that they work and that meritocracy works. The general tenor on the left at that time was these tests were inaccurate, they were missing children of ability, they were allocating positions arbitrarily. Michael Young says, no, 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 the real problem is that they work, that they're accurate, but that the sort of society that you create by selecting people and promoting people on the basis of ability is the opposite of socialism. He was a socialist. He was one of the authors of the Labour Manifesto of 1945. He says he didn't like the sort of society that was being created by the use of these tests, precisely because it promoted people by ability and it revealed very wide differences in people's capacity to do things. And he wanted
that is a painful thing.
Classes.
That is a painful thing. Well, that is
Yes,
a painful
absolutely.
thing for anyone psychologically and socially. But you know, the rub is always, compared to what exactly? Oh, well, compared to my hypothetical utopia. It's like, no, your hypothetical utopia is very low resolution and impractical, and if you implemented it, it wouldn't turn out the way you think it would. So we're not going to go there. How about compared to other real things? And you do that in your book, in your recent book, right? You walk through other forms of social organization. You talk about dynastic organizations, you talk about aristocratic organizations that were based, let's say, mostly on the possession of land and that tended to be hereditary. And so they were unbelievably stratified and also completely immobile. And so you can dream up a non-stratified society, but maybe you could comment on this too. I found out late in my life the existence of the Pareto distribution and the Matthew principle. It's quite common among economists. I mean, we tended to think in psychology that everything was normally distributed, but there's lots of things that aren't. When I developed a test called the Creative Achievement Test, which is widely used psychometrically now, and when we first administered it to hundreds of people, and it was basically, it's a test that sums the number of creative achievements you've concretely made in 13 different creative realms. Well, it was wildly Pareto distributed. The median score was 0 across 13 dimensions.
Right.
But there were people who had scores of 80. You know, they were way out on the tails, and we couldn't even utilize the test. It was hard to utilize the test statistically because it didn't conform to the normal distribution assumptions that underlie, well, IQ testing, for example. That's when I started to become aware of the Pareto distribution. And you know, the Pareto distribution bedevils every society, and so you get stratification. And so these people who are objecting to the meritocracy, okay, well, are they objecting to stratification? And I'd say yes. And so, okay, well, what's the solution to that? Well, then it turns into something like, well, it's capitalism's fault, which is an unbelievably shallow analysis, and that's why I liked your historical approach as well.
What I tried to do in my book was to look at the history of meritocracy and treat it as a historical problem rather than just as a philosophical problem or a legal problem. Because what I wanted to show is that if you look, that meritocracy is a relatively recent thing, and it's an extremely radical thing. And if you look at the history of previous societies, most previous societies have been based on principles other than merit. Because there is an argument that says, of course we all believe in meritocracy, it's a natural way of doing things, and what's the point of it? What's the point of discussing it? Everybody believes it. In fact, for most of human history, societies have not been organised according to the principle of meritocracy. They've been organised according to the principle of the inheritance of positions from father to son, dynasties. They've been organised according to the principle of ascription, whereby the position that you have in society is one that you inherit and one that in somehow is regarded as natural. The world is naturally organised into hierarchies. Shakespeare talks about a great deal about how people should reconcile themselves to their position in society, because if they try and change it, it will cause some terrible problem, almost a psychic problem or a problem in the natural order of things. Untune that string, and what discord follows, as you see in Troilus and Cressida. And also, so you have a notion that a static society is a good society, a hierarchical society is a good society, that power and position and property should flow through families and and dynasties that should rule the world. And also, you get the question of how, in such a society, do you allocate positions? Well, there are actually, very, very significant answers to that. Well, one is that you give them away as patronage. Another is that you buy them and sell them. So there was a huge market in jobs in these pre-meritocratic societies that you would buy a job in the civil service, or you would buy a job as a tax collector. France was a particularly extreme example of this, but most pre-modern societies had a market in jobs. Jobs were regarded as property, and one of the things that didn't exist in that world was the notion that there is a precise relationship between having a job and your ability to perform that job. So I quote the example in the book of a woman called Margaret Scott, who was the wet nurse to the Prince of Wales. In 1783, she was given a pension of £200 a year. And £200 a year in those days was a great deal of money, but it was also a great deal of money when you consider the fact that the Prince of Wales was 23 years old at the time, and so probably not in need of a wet nurse. But there just isn't a notion that a job is something you do, that you need to be qualified for, that is a set of commitments to your employer.
Okay, so let's take that apart for a minute, because partly what you're pointing to is that the idea of meritocracy is so deeply rooted in our culture that we assume that its existence is something akin to a natural fact.
And it's not a natural fact, and it's a fragile fact. It's something that we can lose very easily if we do the wrong things. So that's why I spend so much time talking about history, because what I want to prove in this book is it's something that was created historically and could be destroyed historically. We could move towards a non-meritocratic society, which is what worries me. So
so we assume now, I think, that if I have a job, my job, it doesn't really matter what the job is to produce something productive that other people value in as efficient a manner as possible at a cost that's less than what I'm paid.
Yeah.
Right,
Yes.
right. And all of those assumptions are questionable. And
Absolutely.
right? I mean they're not natural kinds, which is partly what you're pointing out. So all right, so we'll accept that. Let's go to the other side of this for a minute. So part of the problem, I think, is terminology. Part of what makes people resistant to this, because we also tend to sort of casually talk about elite institutions, which implies a kind of moral valuing. We talk about meritocracy, which implies that the people at the top are of greater merit, right? And that means, to the degree that that meritocracy is established on the basis of, let's say, fluid intelligence, that we're conflating moral worth with abstract intellectual ability. And that's really a catastrophe, and that's part of the pride of intellect. And you talked about the best and the brightest, and one of the criticisms that book leveled against the meritocracy was precisely one of intellectual pretension and arrogance, right? It just because you're smart doesn't mean you're good. It doesn't mean you're wise. It doesn't mean you're meritorious. It doesn't even necessarily mean that the decisions you make are going to be better than decisions that other people would make using other means. Now, it's complicated because, as you point out in the book, it's quite likely if you're in the top, let's say, 10th of the IQ distribution and you start poor, that you won't end up poor.
Correct.
Right, and so I believe I read a paper at one point that suggested that you were much better off in the United States if you were born in the top quartile of IQ than if you were born in the top quartile of wealth, if you had to pick at birth.
Yes, I think that's yes. I think there's British evidence of the same thing. Yeah.
And I do have some sympathy. I mean, one of the things I've been trying to sort out in my own mind is the conceptual inadequacy of both the left and the right when it comes to profound individual differences in ability. So I had a client at one point who had an IQ of under 80, and he couldn't read well. He collected a lot of books because he was a bit obsessive, but he couldn't read. And I spent about 30 hours training him to fold a piece of paper, a letter, into 3 equal segments so that it could be put effectively into an envelope with enough accuracy a multitude of such envelopes would actually pass through an envelope sorting machine. And it was something I could do without thinking, and he couldn't really do it after 30 hours of training. And so I struggled for about a year and a half to find him a volunteer job.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out, volunteer jobs are actually harder to get in many ways than paying jobs now, because there's so many police checks and that sort of thing you have to go through, and they're very technically challenging. And I sent him to a government agency that was hypothetically designed to help people like him find a job, and they said, type up your resume and send it out. It's like, well, he can't type and he doesn't have a resume and he can't use a computer, and that's not helpful. Thank you very much. You have no idea what you're dealing with here. And so this 10% of the population, let's say, the liberals think you can train anyone to do anything, which is rubbish. And the conservatives think if you work hard enough, there's no obstacles to your success. And that's also rubbish in some situations, because hard work alone isn't going to do it. And so we have a real conundrum. Now, what we're doing right now, I think, is shooting the messenger. It's like, we don't want to hear this, so we'll get rid of tests that are valid and reliable.
So, at the heart of my DPhil thesis, and also to some extent at the heart of this new book, The Aristocracy of Talent, is this group of psychologists who emerge in the late 19th century and become very dominant in the 20th century up to the 1960s, who are psychometricians, who are concerned with the psychology of individual differences, measuring individual differences. And what I would say that those people are essentially is bell curve liberals. They believe in the bell curve, they believe in the normal distribution, they believe that the range of individual differences is very wide, but they say that those natural facts about the world lead one to liberal conclusions. They lead one to believing in a more active state, a more child-centered set of educational policies, and a more redistribution, more distributive tax system as well. So in Britain, where I think bell curve liberalism is particularly dominant, they would all be members of the Labour Party, or at the very least of the Liberal Party. They would have all voted in 1945 for the Labour Party. They believe that the very fact that people have wide ranges of individual ability means that you have to have an active and generous welfare state. Because it's not their fault that they're not very bright. It's not their fault at the bottom of society that they can't look after themselves. So they need to be, as it were, looked after through a pension system, through a system of redistributive taxation, as I say, through supplements to that.
Well, you're making a case there too. That's an interesting case, because you're actually making the case that it is the observation of genuine and profound differences in people's ability that are fundamental and maybe not even easily changed by social policy, that actually justifies the redistributive welfare state at a moral level. Right, and so that's something for people who oppose the idea of meritocracy to really think about for a while.
Well, I mean, John Rawls actually, it's central to his theory of justice that you should have redistribute. I mean, John Rawls, very interestingly, as a leftist, is also a sort of genetic determinist. He says that people don't own their talents; they inherit their talents. And so, if they're born very bright, it's not because they're morally superior; it's because they happen to be lucky. If they're born not so bright, it's because they happen to be unlucky, and therefore society has an obligation to redistribute resources from the lucky to the unlucky.
I think that's a weak philosophical argument in some sense, because I think you could just as easily say, if that is the case, those a priori presumptions about the distribution of talent, it is in everyone's best interests, regardless of the causes of the differences in ability, to radically incentivize those who can, so they will produce as much as they can for the rest of us who can't.
Yes,
and so
what is interesting about it is that there is a liberal case for redistribution based on the idea of inheritance of people's inherited IQ, and I think that was the dominant position on the left. So we've got a whole bunch, somebody like, let's say, J.B.S. Haldane, who was a sort of Marxist, who was the sort of editor of the Daily Worker, which was the Communist Party magazine, who was also a biologist. He wrote this book, I have it on my shelves here, in 1932, called The Inequality of Man. And it's all about, if we know that people are unequal, what do we do about it? And he thought that what you do about it is have a bigger, more active, more enlightened state. And something happened in let's say in the 1960s, roughly in the 1960s, whereby this notion became forbidden on the left. The left became not only more egalitarian rather than meritocratic, but it also became committed to a blank slate theory of the world. And that anything that questioned the blank slate theory of the world was associated with the right.
Okay, so let me ask you some questions about that. I see the malevolent side of the insistence politically on blank slate as justifying the utopian pretensions of those who would like to remake man in the image of their political ideology. And if the blank slate argument is true, then we could be anything that those who would like to change us could make us into. And why not? And so that bothers me. I also think it's unbelievably naive, both biologically and psychologically. It's clearly not the case. There isn't a deep psychological, biologically minded psychological thinker who adheres to anything like a blank slate theory. Even the behaviorists have completely abandoned that notion, and they probably did the most rigorous job of attempting to test its validity. And then, with regards to the the rejection on the left, let's say, part of that was a consequence of persistent ethnic differences in IQ testing, and that's proved something. Well, no one knows what to do with that. Now, I read some recent work showing that the ethnic differences and racial differences that pop up in the IQ literature are much less evident at the age of 5 and increase over time. And that's quite interesting because it does indicate that perhaps there's an educational deviation that's occurring that's at least in part at the basis of this. But it's proved a very thorny and intractable problem with endless social consequences, particularly in the US. And we don't know what to do with that, I would say. And the easy answer is to say, well, the tests themselves are biased, but then you're stuck with, well, what are you going to use instead, and what do you mean biased, and compared to what exactly?
Yeah, on the ethnic differences, on the group differences, I mean, of course, these are differences between group averages, and that there is an incredibly wide range of talents and abilities within groups. Differences within groups are much bigger than average differences between groups, evidently. But it is a very American set of data, and I think that what we're seeing in Britain at the moment, which is very interesting, I think, is that we've had a series of schools which are called academies, which are a bit like American magnet schools, but they're schools that can select people at the age of 16, once they've done their O-levels, when they go into A-levels. There's a lot of them in the East End of London, in poorer parts of other cities, and we found that these schools, which have been very academically rigorous, very focused on achievement, have been designed to say that if you've got a poor population, what you need to do to it is to give it opportunity and give it rigor rather than sort of dumb down education. And these schools have been extremely good at getting members of ethnic minorities into high quality universities. So there's one called Brampton Manor Academy in the East End of London, which has an ethnic minority dominant population, which has the majority of its students have free school meals, which is a measure of poverty, and they now get as many or more children every year into Oxbridge than Eton does. So, and again, you have, in the United States.
By percent or total number?
In total number. So, in fact, by percent, I think that would be better because Eton's a very big school. So these schools have been doing amazingly well, and they've surprised everybody by how successful they've been. So there is a lot of drive in the poor ethnic minority population. And what we're finding in Britain is that the people who are doing worse are white working class children, particularly white working class boys. And they're being surpassed in education by Afro-Caribbeans, West Indians, and obviously, Oriental Chinese ethnic minorities which have traditionally done very well. So it's a bit of a different picture from the United States.
So what do you think's going on with the white working class in England?
The white working class in England is it's partly that they're living in areas where opportunities don't abound. They're living in the north of England. They're living in areas. These were people who were part of the industrial working class, and we had a massive deindustrialization. Particularly from the 1980s onwards. So they're in left behind areas which have seen their industries destroyed. So that is a depressing thing, and I think that's limited their ambitions. It's certainly limited their access to good schools and ambitious teachers. And I think also you have a culture which tells them that they're bad people, or that we have a culture that celebrates almost every group in society apart from the white working classes.
Yes, particular. Well, I've seen the conflation of ambition and achievement with power and domination in that sort of messaging, right? And those things shouldn't be conflated. It's very disheartening, I think, particularly for boys and girls, even if they're poor, still have the message that's sent pretty strong by our culture that, well, whatever a girl wants to accomplish and achieve, that's to be celebrated. There's no fear of patriarchal power lurking underneath that, let's say. And so, yeah, I think it's dangerous to underestimate the demoralizing effect that kind of language and messaging that's constantly applied actually has.
Yeah. So we and like the United States, about 60% of people in universities now are women, and the people at the people who've got the least opportunities, I would say, are probably the male children of white working class people living in areas like Stoke or Newcastle, who've seen, industrial jobs disappearing, but still have this conception that men must be people who sort of make things or do things, and shouldn't be sitting behind desks or being involved in the caring professions or something like that. And those are the people I think who really are stuck without they don't have role models, and they don't have a general sense of where they fit into the post-industrial hierarchy.
Yeah, well, the attitude that men are people who do things with their hands is a perfectly useful attitude in an industrial society when you're in the lower strata of the population, because that's exactly what the case is, and there's plenty of honor in that as well. And so it's not easy for that to be replaced when that was the basis of productive effort itself and of success. So why do you think that your book has been positively received, all things considered, in the UK? Is the assault on the meritocracy, let's say, or the conflation of the idea of intellectual prowess with merit, maybe, is that not as contentious an issue in general in the UK?
No, we have a lot of the currents that you have in the United States, but in a sort of weaker way, as a sort of echo chamber in the United States. But we still have a memory, I think, of the meritocracy as being something that was progressive, and something that was a cultural memory of the meritocracy being something that's progressive and something that displaced the old aristocratic elite. And I think both the new Tories and the old Labour people can agree that the old aristocratic elite, there's something wrong with them. So we have a better memory of the failures of a pre-meritocratic society than you do in the United States, I think. So I would say I think the situation in the United States is strange, because one of the things that we're better at the moment in Britain is I think promoting social mobility or doing something about social mobility. That, as I say, we've got the academy schools which are providing real opportunities for an excellent education in the inner cities. Oxford and Cambridge are doing something to sort of reach out to a much broader strata of the population. They're creating sort of extra years where they take people from poor backgrounds and give them an extra year's education. So they're basically broadening their selection.
Without abandoning the principle of merit.
I think exactly, without abandoning the principle of merit. They may be softening it a bit in some areas, but in the United States, you still have. Let's say you. I mean, you're not in the United States. I believe you're in Canada, but in
close
the
enough
States,
for now.
they still have legacies which exists. They still have athletic scholarships, which they still have incredible advantages for the children of faculty members. And if you look at the social composition of Harvard, it's an exceptionally elite institution, plutocratic institution. You know, people come from very, very rich backgrounds at Harvard. So I think America at the top of society is doing less to revive the meritocratic spirit than we in Britain are doing. And what it's doing instead, because it sort of feels some sort of vague guilt about the fact that, you know, Harvard is a 1920 rich university, is they leap into wokeism as a sort of, almost as a sort of defense mechanism to their guilt. I happen to believe that a lot of this wokeism is a sort of way in which the old privileged white ruling class holds on to its position by preserving a certain, you know, it's us plus certain selected members of the excluded classes. But
Yeah, well, I saw that often in my students who were of the radical left persuasion at elite institutions like Harvard, where I was there for 7 years as a professor, and then less so at the University of Toronto, but it's a less elite and plutocratic institution by a large margin. But it always grated on me to some degree, because I thought, well, here you are at this institution, and so you are by definition already a member of the class of oppressors that you hypothetically despise. And the fact that you are here and accepted this and going through this means that you've accepted it, and now you want to be on the side of the oppressed, and you want to have all the advantages of the hypothetical oppressor simultaneously. Seems a bit much to ask for, right? To be a victim and an oppressor at the same time.
yeah. Well, I think we should always start with the question of what are you personally willing to give up? But still, I mean, so what? I think one of my worries about abandoning the meritocratic principle, I think that, as I said, the meritocratic principle is something that's fragile. It's something that was created relatively recently in history. It's something that can be destroyed. And once you start making exceptions, so we'll make an exception for the children of faculty members, we'll make an exception for alumni, we'll make an exception for people who give us a lot of money, we'll make an exception for people who are born into certain groups of the population, we'll accept the meritocratic principle. Ultimately, you end up completely destroying the meritocratic principle, but you also end up reintroducing the idea that people should be judged as members of groups. And the fundamental thing about the meritocratic principle is you judge people as individuals, not as members of groups. And as soon as you begin to reintroduce this collective principle, judging people by members of groups, then you have a different principle on the basis.
Okay, so so are there advantages, do you think, to classifying people by group if we play devil's advocate? Because I see that exactly the same thing happening. There's this insistence that immutable group identity should trump individual merit. And then there's a deeper criticism, which is, and here the deepest criticism in some sense is, your understanding of merit, your conception of merit, and I'm speaking of you personally as an advocate of this position, is nothing but a reflection of your unreflected demand, say, to justify your position as a beneficiary of the 11th system, and also to justify the privilege you have as a member of your particular ethnicity and background.
Sure.
That's Foucault's criticism, right, of virtually everything.
Well, let me answer those two questions, and I think you probably won't agree with my first answer. But I think that there are certain groups of people who, by dint of their history, do deserve to be treated as groups who've been collectively wronged. And this is I've been a long-term opponent of affirmative action. I've now come round to seeing its merits, because I think the African American population in the United States, because of the legacy of slavery, because of the legacy of Jim Crow, and because redlining and segregation by residents lasted for such a long time in the United States, that there is a case for for affirmative action, for reaching out positively to look for talent and to look for potential, and making an incredibly hard effort to do that as a way of making up for historical wrongs, but historical wrongs which continue